Hola, muy buenas noches. El 13 de enero de 2010, Cristobal Bellolio escribió por Twitter: hay que empezar ya a pensar en un partido liberal de verdad, sin los resentimientos del pasado. 9 días después, mencionó por primera vez en la misma red social a Red Liberal. 7 meses después, se lanzó oficialmente Red Liberal, un movimiento político que prometía ser un liberalismo de quiltros, sin amo ni maestro, que buscase vivir entre pares, entre iguales. En estos 10 años hemos tenido el privilegio de ver cómo han aparecido nuevos actores, políticos y académicos, que han llevado las banderas liberales sin avergonzarse de su nombre. Desde el 2010 en adelante, fuimos los primeros en decir sin miedo: somos liberales. Y a partir de eso, se construyó la casa de todos los liberales. Hoy los liberales demócratas estamos políticamente divididos principalmente en 3 partidos, y algunos pocos en otros partidos de mayor antigüedad. El sueño del Red Liberal de convertirse en un gran partido político ya no es posible, o al menos está postergado. Los hermanos que nacieron después tienen mayor éxito, han tenido mayor éxito en la búsqueda de competir por el poder, bajo las ideas de igualdad y libertad. Sin embargo, la sabiduría que nos da el tiempo nos hace ver que sigue siendo posible trabajar en la creación de un espacio común, más allá de la acción propia de un partido político. En Red Liberal no nos olvidamos de los 3 acuerdos originales de 2010. El primer acuerdo: encontramos nuestra idea fundamental de libertad en la tradición del liberalismo. Esta es aquella que concibe la autonomía de cada individuo para perseguir el proyecto de vida que estime conveniente. Como dicen por ahí, para que vivas la vida que quieras, no la que te tocó. El segundo acuerdo: reconocemos que la libertad no es el valor supremo cuando se carece de condiciones mínimas de vida. La libertad como elección pierde su sentido cuando la pobreza y la marginación eliminan las opciones. El tercer acuerdo: entendemos que la libertad contemporánea consiste principalmente en el disfrute de la independencia privada, pero no abandonamos el espacio de conversación y deliberación sobre los asuntos públicos. Aspiramos a un modelo de liberalismo republicano que incentive a las personas a participar de la construcción de lo colectivo. El desafío actual de Red Liberal es ser una plataforma de participación política, hacer que los jóvenes militen, que vivan la democracia, porque cuando se acaba la democracia, comienza la dictadura. En Red Liberal sabemos que el liberalismo está en permanente construcción. Reflejo de esto es la invitada que tenemos hoy en día. Elizabeth Anderson viene a mover los límites del liberalismo, proponiendo poner el foco más allá de la distribución económica y la igualdad de oportunidades en lo material. Propone tratar a las empresas con el mismo miedo que los libertarios tratan al Estado, y viene a proponer que jamás podamos perder nuestra condición de ciudadanos, independiente de la cuna o de las malas decisiones que uno libremente tome. Los dejo con Claudia Negri.
Sorry, I did not unmute myself. There we are. Firstly, I would like to welcome all of you today, especially Professor Anderson. It's our pleasure to have her with us today, and we are very excited about the conversation. To introduce briefly the current affairs in Chile, the country has been suffering a series of transformations, which we could define as structural ones, since the protest started last October in 2019. The social unrest summed up with the COVID-19 and the upcoming economic crisis creates a challenge for the country, which we should take as an opportunity for changing and creating a more fair and equal country. During this talk, we would like to discuss several of these issues with Professor Anderson. Professor Anderson received her PhD in philosophy from Harvard, is Arthur F. Trudeau Professor and John Dewey Distinguished University Professor of Philosophy and Women's Studies. She's renowned for her works in various areas, which include democratic theory, equality in political philosophy and American law, racial integration, the ethical limits of markets, theory of value and rational choice, the philosophies of John Stuart Mill and John Dewey, social epistemology and feminist epistemology, and philosophy of science. One of the many interesting ideas we would like to reflect upon with Professor Anderson is Professor Anderson's suggestions about relational equality, where she explains that it isn't enough to create a social protection network or system, depending how, as a public policy to avoid falling into poverty. Rather, we need to create a system of democratic security to ensure that we remain citizens of the Republic. Sorry if the translation is not the best. I've translated from Spanish. So
yeah, that's very good, actually.
So the conversation will be led by both Dr. Bellolio and Dr. Brieba, both doctors in political science and experts in liberalism, so I leave the floor to them.
Professor Anderson, we're really excited to have you here, as we've already told you. And I guess in this conversation, we aim to link many of your ideas to current affairs and current problems, both in the world and in Chile, in as much as I think they have a lot of relation to one to another. So let me start. I think, broadly speaking, what we aim to do with Cristobal is I'll start and take about half the time, perhaps drawing slightly more on your actual theses and ideas, and then Cristobal will broaden the front a little more to more current events. So that way, I think that will work best. So I wanted just to start by asking you to briefly explain the main idea behind democratic equality, especially considering that today inequality is at the forefront of the political agenda all over the world. We see inequality has risen in many advanced countries, not necessarily so in Latin American countries, but they already had high inequality to begin with. And the problem of equality is at the forefront of the political agenda generally. So which inequalities do you think are legitimate or acceptable in a democratic society? And how does democratic equality play into all of this?
Yes, so there are certain inequalities in the distribution of income and wealth that I think are consistent with a free society of equals. So, on my view, the goal of egalitarianism is to create a society of equals that is also a free society, that is where individuals do enjoy their own liberties. And there are material prerequisites to achieving such a society. Everyone needs enough resources and opportunities to be able to function as an equal in society. But we also have other social needs that may entail certain kinds of material inequalities. And you just want to limit them so that they don't create a society in which some people have unjust power over others, can treat them with impunity, abuse them in various ways, constrain their liberties and opportunities arbitrarily. I think we are now far past the point where material inequalities have created gross inequalities of power and esteem that are fundamentally incompatible with a free society of equals and with a democracy. I think things have gotten much worse in the past 40 years or so with the rise of neoliberalism and global economic policies that created a set of rules of international capital that grossly overweighted the interests of capital owners relative to everyone else, the interests of workers in particular, and just ordinary people who may be doing things that are not necessarily in the paid labor market, dependent caretakers, for instance, within the family.
Excellent. And could you explain to us, for viewers that are not familiar with the distinction between relational inequality and inequality of resources? Like, why is your emphasis more on relational equality rather than the more traditional resource-based vision of what inequality means, and why do you think that relational inequality is more important?
Yes, so look, there are all kinds of accidental inequalities that I don't think are in themselves unjust. So, for instance, there are natural inequalities of talent and potential. My thesis advisor, John Rawls, argued that there are ways to actually make the diversity and inequalities of talents across the population redound to everyone's benefit by organizing the roles of society appropriately. And I think that's by and large correct. So there's no reason for anyone to feel that there was some injustice in the world that you have musical or scientific prodigies who just are way more talented than the vast majority of people. I don't consider that an injustice. Now, what could be an injustice is that if you exalted these people above everyone else and let them off the hook from having to obey the laws that everyone else has to do or give them absurd privileges, then that could be a problem. But if in fact they use their talents to in ways that promote the well-being of other people by bringing wonderful musical performances or great scientific discoveries, we should be pleased about that and not envious.
Regarding that same topic then, you've written about the role of elites in a democratic society. Elites are a bit of a bad word these days.
Yes.
Right?
We can talk about that. So all I mean by elites is whenever you get society or any organization within a society at a large enough scale, in order to manage it, it's going to require different occupations and offices in which some people have organizational authority over others. And so the elites are just the people who hold the positions of higher responsibility and authority. There's really just no other feasible way. You can't have participatory democracy in a firm with 1,000 people, right? You're just not going to get anything done, right? You just need, a very tiny groups. Yes, they could be good participatory Democrats, but really that system breaks down pretty quickly once you scale up. So all I mean by elites are people who occupy those slots in various organizations, of which the state is just one.
Exactly.
And so I don't mean by elites people who have exalted privileges, because within a liberal democratic order, with power always comes responsibility and accountability. That's the critical feature of democracy. People don't exercise unaccountable power. They're not entitled to it. Power is always accountable to those who are governed by it.
Exactly.
And that's how you restore, that's how you make the need for a limited kind of functional or organizational hierarchy compatible with a society of equals. And on top of that, of course, the power is limited strictly to the functions needed within that role. So that once you're stepping out of that role, say you're just out to dinner, you don't get to order people around, right? You can only do that within the organization, whatever it might be.
So you've written about the way these elites, functional elites, are selected into their offices. And you've talked about integration into those elites. I think that is a very relevant feature for the situation we have in Chile right now, in which elites are broadly questioned precisely because they come, broadly speaking, of course, from a rather closed social circle consisting of quite a few private schools, which pretty much dominate the selection of elites. There is even some research by Chicago economist Zimmerman, I think is his last name, in which he shows that the top managerial positions in the largest, most important Chilean companies are dominated by people who come from a few top universities, which in itself might not be so problematic, but they need, in addition to that, they need to be from a few, like 7 or 8 social elite high schools, which dominate.
Oh, wow.
The
That's
agenda.
no good at all.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So how far do you think this sort of selection integration should go? Should companies actually select actively on gender, on class, on race? Or should we use, should they be forced to by the state? How do you see that integration taking place?
Yeah. So in the American context, firms are not allowed to select directly on race or gender, but there are indirect methods to ensure adequate representation. I don't actually have a particular problem with quotas. I'm just describing the limits in the United States. I think quotas could actually have significant uses, and in particular, in the Chilean system, it seems to me that there's a desperate need to break open the lock that these few schools have on elite positions. It's just crazy because what happens is you get these very insular subcultures where everybody knows everybody, and then they're entirely ignorant about the circumstances and lives of anyone who wasn't privileged enough to go to those schools. And consequently, an elite formed in that way is going to be incompetent, if only because of their ignorance. It really just, why do we think that just because they managed to score highly on some tests that, the super elite schools gave excellent preparation for, that those tests actually measure the knowledge that's relevant for making sure that when one is exercising the authorities one has within an organization, one is actually responsive to the needs and interests of everybody else whom one affects in decision making. Indeed, I think we can be fairly confident that people who have lived such sheltered lives only in these elite circles are overwhelmingly ignorant of the effects that their decision making has on people who are outside of those circles. So
Actually,
we should open up.
Actually, that reminded me of one of his mottos or phrases that have come out of the Chilean protest, was that there was a lot of elite people saying something like "no lo vimos venir," which is we didn't see it coming about the protest.
Right.
So
Yeah.
that goes in line with what you're saying. Now,
Yeah.
some people have talked even of abolishing private schools. Do you think such a measure would be good, or is it taking things too far? I know you've written, at least in the American context, that we have to distinguish between schools that give better preparation to students and that benefits everyone, from just all boys networks, and that those are two very different things. One might two very different arguments in the discussion about private schools.
Yes. So, one of the difficulties it's true in the American context, we have spectacular amounts of religious diversity in the United States. Americans are very creative with religions, and there's practically a new religion invented like every month. and so they also tend to form schools. In reality, a lot of these religious schools are not particularly privileged. They're private schools, but in fact, they're not really elite. There's a handful And and then there are some famous, very, very famous elite schools like Harvard. And there's a handful of them. But actually, in the US context, we're such a gigantic country, and there are so few seats in these ultra elite Ivy League schools and a handful of liberal arts schools. They're a minute percentage of all of the college educated students, and there are vastly more elite positions than could be filled by even all of the graduates, right? So in fact, there's absolutely, it is true that places like Harvard have grossly excessive authority and power to situate their students in advantageous ways. But I think in the U.S. context, it's very much diluted by just the vast variety of schools that are out there. What concerns me more, the greatest failure actually of the United States, is that we have so many schools for younger children that are grossly inadequate and just simply fail to educate very poor children, Black children, immigrant children. And that's really a catastrophe, because then the kids grow up and they're functionally illiterate even if they manage to graduate high school. And that's an unmitigated disaster. Everybody needs, and there's no reason why they couldn't get an adequate high school education. But we're not actually achieving that in the United States. That's really the great failure of American education. I'm not so worried about the higher levels, just because of the sheer scale of this country. The influence of a place like Harvard or Princeton is just diluted by the huge scale. Mm-hmm. In smaller countries, it could become more of a challenge. And then I think there is a deep need to distribute resources more equitably, so that it's not just a handful of schools that get the lion's share of resources, and that's just to open up opportunities to people. And also those schools, really, how are they selecting their students? That could be very problematic too, if it's just like some privileged set of families that are reproducing themselves over time.
I think that more or less fairly describes the schools I was talking about here in Chile. But you mentioned these poor schools for poor children, and that's a problem we have too, of course, that education generally is the achievements of students are not very high generally. But in democratic equality, you talk about sufficiency, right? About a certain level that everyone ought to have to become a full citizen. And I wanted to take you to a closely related topic for education, or more broadly, social rights. That's something that has been prevalent in the Chilean discussion and political agenda for quite a few years. We're probably writing a new constitution soon. Do you think that focus on social rights is adequate and necessary for achieving this level of sufficiency everyone ought to have? And do you think social rights ought to be in the Constitution, or does that not matter in itself too much?
So it might be a good move, but it depends on the critical issue about constitutionalization is the Constitution structured in such a way to guarantee adequate funding for the social rights? Usually budgetary issues are rather separate from constitutional issues. And so you could have all these fancy words in the Constitution. It doesn't necessarily translate into resources. So what's happened in the United States, all of the 50 states have state constitutions in which a right to an education, to a free public education, is guaranteed. So that might seem really great, except when push comes to shove, when you ask a judge to enforce that ruling, they don't have a taxing power. And so there have been in a few states very bold judges who just knock down the whole financing scheme and say on the ground that it's not giving poor children an adequate education. So occasionally you have very bold judges who are willing to go that far. But we've also had judges in other states under their state constitutions who have accepted that it's okay if the free public education is so bad that a child graduating from high school will have no prospects other than completely unskilled manual labor, and that's something that they would be consigned to life. That I think is outrageous, but it's really hard. And the judges basically say, well, we don't have the taxing power. I can't demand more, So I don't think we should put too much confidence in social rights written into the Constitution. Maybe it will help. But often we just find a lot of ways in which social rights get evaded because judges in the end are not very good at making public policy decisions. They haven't been trained for that. They don't really have the authority. How much is enough? And again, we have a very mixed record in the United States. Some judges have been great and really have gotten the issues and have boldly used their power, but others, they just feel like it's beyond them.
Right. So moving on, before handing it over to Cristobal, I wanted to ask you a bit more theoretical question, but then take it into the practical to connect it with your last book as well. I wanted to ask you about your how you view the relationship between freedom and equality. Freedom in the liberal tradition is usually understood as non-interference, right? From Hobbes and Isaiah Berlin and so forth. But you do not share that definition of freedom in your work, and yet you tie it closely to equality. There are other definitions, non-domination, the idea of sen, of capabilities. How do you tie all of these things together? How do you believe freedom and equality ought to be related? How do you understand the two?
Yes.
Can we have one without the other?
Yeah, right. Well, I mean, the great thing about the Republican non-domination formula is that there you can see deep conceptual links between freedom and equality. So if to be free is not to be dominated by another, then you can ask, well, what are the social conditions of non-domination? Well, I take it that a critical one is that if somebody has some kind of authority to say issue orders to you, that they can be held to account by the people to whom the orders are issued. And that requires some kind of voice, within the organization, whether it be the state or a firm or what have you, on the part of the governed, that is some kind of democratic ordering. And democracy is the way we socially organize equality. So we then get a very nice conceptual connection between freedom and equality. So there's something nice about that formula. I'm not such a fan of the way Phil Pettit renders it, because I think he draws an artificial contrast between Republican freedom and liberal freedom on the ground that Republican freedom is also interested in the security of one's liberty, that it's not just, you might be, some dictator might give you freedom, but then take it away at a whim. But in fact, liberal rights and liberal constitutional regimes have always cared about securing individual liberties with various procedural rights against having them arbitrarily infringed and so forth. So I think actually Philip's way of drawing that distinction is rather artificial. And what I like about the non-domination formula is it creates a vivid image in our mind about the fact that what's at stake here is social relationships. it's, domination. It's like one person can arbitrarily restrain your options or order you around, and you don't have much say about it. Okay, we have a vivid idea of what that's like. That's both a condition of unfreedom and a condition of inequality, of social hierarchy.
Excellent. So non-domination is the key here. So that's what you say as well in your recent book, Private Government, right? When you take this idea to the firm. I thought I'd never thought of the firm in that way. My original training was in economics, so I had accepted, I guess, the model of the contract, the labor contract, where two free parties contract, me as a worker, my employer, but I'm free to leave, so it's just a contract, right? So could you explain to us what does this mean, having domination inside the firm, and why do you think that in spite of this free contract, this is basically a relation of unfreedom?
Well, within the firm, we have an organization that's composed of hierarchies where you have bosses issuing orders to workers. The mere fact that you have the right to quit or that you have an exit right doesn't take away from the fact that internally the governance of the firm is hierarchical. And capitalist firms disempower workers. Workers don't really have any say, unless maybe they're represented by a labor union, but worldwide labor union representation has been, labor union membership has been declining, and unions have been weakened over time. And that's a function of the rules of our international order, which give capital huge advantages over labor through our World Trade Organization and other trade pacts. So workers really have been on the short end of the stick.
So do you think that there should be a sort of constitution of the firm in terms of more explicit rights of what companies have a right to do to workers and what they don't have a right to do? I mean, for instance, what if a worker says something offensive or racist or whatever on their Facebook posts outside work? Usually consumers get very scandalized with these things and demand that the firm, fire the worker. But that's something he or she did outside work. What should a company do in that instance? Do you think they should have a right to fire?
Yeah, this question, of course, as you know, is coming up constantly in the United States. And I actually think that we should, in general, secure workers in their off-duty freedom of speech. There are certain exceptions to that. So, if a worker is off-duty harassing their coworkers on social media, right, and being really obnoxious to them, okay, I think they're not working as they can't really be a good team member if that's what they're doing off duty to their coworkers. So there are some things like that. The difficulty I have is that even though if they're being racist or misogynistic or something, just say spouting off offensive political opinions on their Facebook page or what have you. And it might be very offensive to other people, but all kinds of opinions are very offensive. People have religious opinions. They have all kinds of opinions that other people object to. And I don't think we should be recruiting bosses to enforce speech rules on workers. And again, there are some exceptions. If there's somebody who holds a position of power and authority within the firm, and they say something racist or sexist, the firm could say, well, look, functionally, like, how could we trust you to treat everyone equally within the firm if these are your opinions that you're expressing off duty? So I think that, if you're high up in the hierarchy and you actually have power over other people in the firm, okay, well, that's a different situation. And yes, and then also, if you're the CEO or a major spokesperson, then the public face of the firm is basically you and people at your rank. And the firm could say, look, we stand for other values. And so we're firing you because these are not our values. And that's okay, because these are people who have power and they want those values. The corporation says they want non-discriminatory values to be what the corporation itself practices. And so you can't give positions of authority to people who repudiate those values. That's totally legitimate. But if you're just talking about, you know, some delivery person or somebody in another low-level position who spouts off something that you know is obnoxious, I don't in general think that no one thinks that such a person is speaking for the firm or has power to shape the firm's values in line with these bigoted opinions. And so I think it would be proper to protect workers' free speech rights in contexts like that, and say, no, they just have a right not to be fired. And the difficulty is, by giving bosses the right to fire for some obnoxious opinion, well, then they can fire for any opinions. They could fire somebody because they're not supporting the preferred political candidate of the head of the corporation. Do we want that? I don't think we want that. So yes, I think there's, you know, that means that we have to put up sometimes with some obnoxious people, but that's, you know, life in civil society.
Okay. Thanks, Professor. I'm turning over to Cristobal now, so you can continue this conversation. Yep.
Professor Anderson, it's a real pleasure to have you with us. I have a couple of questions. You have written on the epistemic virtues of protesting as a way to gather information in democracy that may supplement traditional voting. So last year, for example, Chileans experimented an intense wave of protests, which could be read under two different lights. On the one hand, we may say it's a deepening of democracy. Actually, The Economist have recently placed Chile for the first time, I think, as a full democracy, only after these protests, as if they were crucial for a vibrant political life. However, on the other hand, it seems that this sort of democratic awakening comes sometimes at the cost of liberal principles, or liberal constitutionalism, if you want, such as the rule of law, or individual liberties, private property, of course, procedural justice, or the due process, and so on. So in this sense, some scholars have defined populism as a democratic response to a liberal democracy that has become too liberal, but less and less democratic. For Kasmude, Yasha Munk, I'm thinking. So if this is so, populism means illiberal democracy, or something along those lines. So what do you think should be the liberal attitude to populism thus conceived? So I'm aware that populism is a buzzword, mostly thrown in political debates as an insult, pretty much, as demagoguery or fiscal irresponsibility. But this is not what I mean here. That's what I stress, the idea of a democratic response to, we may say, undemocratic liberalism. So, and the idea that this undemocratic liberalism is taking from collective decisions more and more, from collective will, more and more decisions, and place these decisions on unelected bodies, contra-majoritarian mechanisms, or supranational entities, etc. So I want to know your thoughts in this idea of conceiving populism as a democratic response to anti-democratic liberalism, and also about this distinction between a liberal way and a populist way to understand politics. Pretty much the Chantal Mouffe critique to Rawls and Habermas. So the liberal way would be the this way of carrying a promise of rational deliberation and consensus among universally devised individuals. And the populist way will be highlighting the role of agonistic conflict, of interest and passions, and of course the corresponding idea that consensus is a mirage, if not the hidden will of the establishment. So how do you think liberals should face this sort of populist threat thus conceived?
Yes. Okay. So I think it's important to distinguish two different kinds of movements and protests that are called populist. So in one kind of movement, the movement, and this is what we see, say, with Viktor Orban, illiberal democracy. On that kind of movement, the people are defined as only a subset of the citizens, and others are excluded. Okay, and I really don't see that as compatible with democracy. I think it's even a contradiction in terms to call that democracy. On my view, democracy is not just the whatever majority you can cobble together imposing its will without compromise or consultation on some despised minority groups. That just is incompatible with democracy constitutively.
With democracy or with liberal democracy?
No, with democracy itself. I mean,
okay.
Democracy, I think, it requires government by discussion among equals. So you cannot just outline certain groups that are going to be permanently subordinated or marginalized within the polity just because of who they are. But then there's another kind of protest movement, social movement that is called populist. And here the paradigm would be something like Black Lives Matter, maybe, or the Occupy movement in the United States. We are the 99%, okay? What does that slogan say? It's not saying we want to disenfranchise the 1%. It's saying we want a seat at the table. We want to be included and have a voice, not to exclude others, but to be included. Now, what's interesting is empirically, what gives rise to both types of populist movement is a kind of grievance that one has not been represented. One hasn't been effectively represented. And empirically, right, that feeling, that grievance, often does have some real force to it. But it could be expressed in an exclusionary way or in an inclusive way. And I think the only democratic way is inclusive.
Okay. I have another question, which I think to some extent is linked to Daniel's previous ones. There have been some theoretical attempts to bridge the distance between classic liberalism and liberal egalitarianism. So I'm thinking about John Tomas's, for example, John Tomas's project of mostly reconciling Hayek and Rawls. While you are usually regarded as an illustrious member of the liberal egalitarian tribe, I would say, you have also written in favor of Hayek's theory of market prices to some extent, if I recall correctly. As many social media debates in Chile, but I can imagine worldwide, pit classical against egalitarian liberals, arguing who's legit and who's the fake liberal. It might be interesting to it might be interesting to have to hear your thoughts on whether these reconciling projects are promising or intellectually sound, or otherwise we should part company. and
Yes,
therefore
okay,
say,
that's really great.
or therefore say
Thank you for asking that
like Samuel
question.
Freeman, no, I'm sorry, classical
Yeah,
liberals like libertarians are not liberal enough.
Yes, yes. So I've actually been doing a deep dive into the classical political economists, particularly Adam Smith, John Stuart Mill, and Karl Marx. And all through the lens of the Protestant work ethic. And basically what I'm arguing is that there is a deep pro-worker work ethic that has from the beginning competed with a very harsh and inegalitarian version of the work ethic within the entire history of political economy. So you could see on the right, conservative versions of the work ethic expressed by people like Thomas Malthus and Nassau Senior, who authored the first welfare reform in England, and people like that. Now, what I find very interesting about this moment, and in particular about Adam Smith and Mill, is that they were vividly aware that if workers are to actually get the fruits of their labor, and obviously Marx is somewhat different, but within a market system, if workers are to get the fruits of their labor and to be treated decently and to enjoy some level of autonomy, you have to engineer markets appropriately, the rules of markets, the rules of property. What's happened rhetorically in the 20th century is that people have taken this term free markets and private property, and they think that what it means is something specific, namely a neoliberal order in which basically all the power is handed over to the owners of capital. Whereas my position is we need markets. Markets perform indispensable functions. We don't have a good substitute for them, and they can do a very good job. But we have to recognize that markets are delicate products of social engineering with very important consequences for power relations and for with distributive consequences as well. And consequently, we have to engineer the rules of property and markets so that they can secure.
But do you think classical liberals
society.
don't you think that classical liberals would understand engineering the market as a sort of top-down intervention and not an emergent order bottom-up?
Look, I just think it's illusion that the whole idea of emergent order is completely out of touch with what the classical economists said. Okay? Adam Smith says if you want free markets, you have to abolish many forms of property right. You have to abolish primogeniture and entail, which locked up property through inheritance rules that perpetuated useless dynasties of lazy landlords. You have to abolish slavery. You have to abolish joint stock corporations. Okay, like he's out to abolish and all kinds of chartered monopolies. Right, he's out to abolish all this stuff, all kinds of property rights. I mean, it's definite engineering. If you look at John Stuart Mill,
Yeah, sure.
he basically argued that you should eliminate the landlord class in Ireland. Just wipe it out. Just zero out their property rights in the land itself. Literally, he said that. No, all the property should be, he had some compensation scheme. So, the lazy landlords would get some cash. Okay. But they would no longer own the property. The property should be owned by the people who work it, namely the Irish peasants. He was a huge advocate for peasants, and that required a radical restructuring of property rights in Ireland.
Related
So
to this,
they're all in favor of engineering these things, engineering property rules, engineering markets. They're vividly aware that these things are constructed by law, and they have distributive consequences, profound distributive consequences, depending on how you design the rules. And they very consistently argued that the rules should be designed to secure for workers good wages, a decent standard of living, right? Dignity, autonomy, opportunities for advancement, and the cultivation of their talents. That's what they wanted. Now, you might argue, okay, they didn't see far enough, and so the rules that they proposed weren't good enough. But of course, these people are they're good empiricists. Okay, so we try this, and if it's not good enough, we can go back and re-rig the rules.
yeah,
There's
surely.
no question, though, that they're in favor of rigging the rules in favor of the workers.
And this is a question that I've received from people that understand themselves as classical liberals, but I don't think I have a good answer. Maybe, I'm sure you have a better answer than mine. Some people struggle to find relevant differences between roles in liberalism, or if you want, liberal egalitarianism, and what we used to call social democracy. So are we talking about the same here? Are they distinguishable by the origin, for example? Or maybe we're talking about different levels, like one is a doctrinal and the other is like a political project or program. How do you distinguish or relate liberal egalitarianism and what we used to call social democracy?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a really great question, because social democracy came out of Marxism.
And liberal egalitarianism is from the other way around, isn't it?
You see, actually, well, here's the irony, though. There's just endless ironies in this history. So if we look at one of the centerpieces of social democratic policy, it's comprehensive social insurance, old age pensions, unemployment insurance, health insurance, all this kind of stuff. Absolutely central to the social democratic order. But who thought up social insurance? Liberals, Thomas Paine, Condorcet. They are the two originators. These people are not Marxists, okay? Now, it was adopted, right, by revisionist Marxists, who themselves, I mean, there are just so many ironies about the history of social democracy. So consider, for instance, that we identify Marxism with a commitment to revolutionary overthrow of the capitalist system. But yet, Marx himself had a big argument, as we know, with Bakunin over the First International. And he called, in the last basic large meeting of the First International, he called for the working classes to organize political parties and compete for seats in the parliaments of the emerging democracies of Europe. So Marx already planted the seeds for a democratic version of Marxism, a non-revolutionary, or what they call revisionist Marxism, by calling for workers to organize within democracy and fight for their interests within the emerging parliamentary systems of the late 19th century. Okay, well, you carry that forth, right? And then, do we really need revolution and overthrowing everything? Well, we see where that landed us. Revolutions in the violent sense are very dangerous, especially when you actually look at the Marxists themselves, who didn't really have a clear idea of what to do with power once you overthrew everything. And that was a problem that was faced in the Paris Commune. It was faced in the French Revolution. It's kind of like, okay, what do we do next? Terror? I don't think so. That's not really a great idea. We tried. It didn't work out so well. Right. So there's already, I think, what we see here, and this, of course, was the argument advanced by Edward Bernstein, the great sort of originator of revisionist Marxism, in his wonderful work, Evolutionary Socialism. It's that the left needs liberalism. It needs liberal democracy for workers to advance their interests. There's a real convergence here.
Interesting. Last question. We're in the midst of a pandemic, so it suddenly feels that expert opinion is more valuable than ever. But expert opinion appears to be elitist and exclusive, thus in tension with democratic ideas of epistemic egalitarianism or whatever. So I remember David Eslund quote, expert may know a lot, but nobody made them bosses. So, however, following Rawls, the so-called public reason liberals used to think that the methods and conclusions of science are especially weighty inputs to political debates. So I'm not saying that liberals embrace scientism, but they seem to think that there's something about the scientific way of reasoning that transcends or is capable to transcend sectarian allegiances and comprehensive doctrines, as if it were a sort of an epistemic overlapping consensus. But again, scientific knowledge tends to be complex and elaborated, almost esoteric, you may say, for untrained minds. I don't understand quantum physics, for example. So what kinds of expert and scientific knowledge should we consider public in the Rawlsian sense, or if you prefer, especially valuable in political deliberation? So think about climate change, for example. Let us say that 95% of the relevant community of experts agree that climate change is real, it's man-made, and we should take urgent action to tackle it. But 50%, or just, I'm inventing, 50% of the wider population doesn't think so. Maybe encouraged by politicians who want to reopen coal mines to provide jobs. So Rawls says that this scientific argument should be non-controversial, but non-controversial to whom? To the relevant community of experts or to the general population? If the former, it doesn't match with the spirit of public reason, but if the latter, then almost no science would qualify. Actually, we have governments that they don't believe in coronavirus or vaccination or whatever. So it would be nice to have your thoughts on this, because I know you have a paper on lay assessment of expert opinion.
Yes. So yeah, there's a lot packed into that. And I just want to kind of step back and think a little bit about both climate change and the current pandemic, because there's another issue that is affecting popular opinion about these scientific claims, and that is that we have a information space that is polluted by deliberate misinformation that has been placed there by actors with ulterior motives. So if you look, for instance, at climate change denialism, it's essentially all funded by the fossil fuel industry. Okay, and they're lying to people. Now, yes, it is true that coal miners, okay, have their own interests in opposing climate change action, because then they would lose all of their jobs. But if it was just a matter of jobs, it would be easy enough to construct alternative employment and all kinds of compensation for the remaining coal miners. Like it's you could just do regular kind of compromise deals and buy people out. But in fact, what's happened, at least in the United States, is that people have attached their identities to certain, basically to the consumption of fossil fuels. And then the issue is, if people have turned this into a kind of culture war, we have to figure out techniques for helping people see that their identities are not so threatened as we could imagine. And this is a place where I think the standard Rawlsian move of paring down discourse to a very spare vocabulary is probably not effective or a good idea.
What do you mean?
Instead, what we should do is help people see how their identities could even be enhanced. So maybe they're not so keen on hugging trees. Okay, that's not part of their cultural identity. But they do like in America, the climate change deniers would really love to be entrepreneurs and making money on their own. Okay, so what you pitch to them is let everyone have solar power on their roofs, and then you could make money. Instead of having to pay these utility companies, they pay you. That's very appealing. In fact, it's wildly popular. If you look at who's installed solar, it's like people in Arizona and Florida. A lot of Republicans live there. Right? Or if you look at wind power, the greatest installations of wind power in the United States are in Texas, the great oil state. Okay, because there's money to be made by setting a wind turbine on your ranch. A lot of money.
That's a way to defeat denial politically. But in a theoretical level, what do you think about the weight of scientific arguments in political deliberation?
Yes. So look, people are capable of recognizing that there are certain questions that they don't have the expertise to answer.
Yeah.
And it's not contrary to democracy as long as these experts, like Dr. Fauci, right, they have to support their arguments by means of published knowledge that anybody could, even if they can't read the papers, they can at least vet who's writing the papers by, checking to seeing whether it's just some crackpot or research that actually has empirical support.
So a second order assessment.
Second order assessment.
My problem is that if you are an anti-vaccine group, for example, and you only talk with your own friends in a Facebook group, let's say, you don't go through that second order assessment process. You just are in sort of an echo chamber, in a bubble.
Yeah, I understand that. And then, you see, that's why I think for cases like that, you have people who have been exposed to a deliberately distorted information environment. Okay. And so they've been deceived in certain ways. And then we have to approach the question as one of democratic communication.
Okay.
That is, how can we address people? Because people have real concerns that these vaccines are really dangerous.
Yeah.
Okay.
Some
and
of them are
that's not
sincere.
a crazy concern. They're sincere.
Yeah.
But they're not beyond persuasion. And we have excellent examples of how that's worked. But you do have to win their trust. And that requires treating people like that with respect and listening carefully to their concerns. You can't just sort of impose something on them or call them stupid because they believe something that's false. There are other ways to approach this that are democratic and respectful, and that are capable of winning trust.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm done. Let's move to the next round of questions. I think we have something prepared. Do we?
Yes, Cristobal. We have a round of questions now, and we are going to start with Carolina Toha. She's a former mayor of Santiago, a former minister. And Carolina, can you start, please?
I'm not hearing Carolina. Oh, there, yes.
Hello, everybody. Hello, Professor Anderson. Thank you very much for being here, or for being there, really, but being with us.
Yeah.
I would like to ask you about the role of conflict, social tension, and antagonism in the path of fighting for democratic equality. In Chile, we are living a great crisis, political and social crisis, motivated by a claim against inequality. The demand has strained the country's climate, political climate, and sparked protest demonstrations daily, really daily, every day, and has generated a climate of discredit against all the authorities and against the elite in general. Some people say that it's necessary to move toward a greater equality, but leaving aside the political tension and protest, they think that such a level of conflict is dangerous for democracy. And others say that without this tension, this conflict, this level of demonstrations every day, there will be no progress. They think that democracy has to be able to process this level of conflict. So I would like to know, what do you think? Although if you're not familiar with particularities of Chilean reality, I'm interested in your opinion about the role of conflict, of antagonism, tension in the fight for equality.
Yes. So this gets back to the issue of protest movements and social movements. They're absolutely indispensable for equality. If you have an entrenched elite that's very privileged and self-reproducing, it's the only way to wake them up. You have to disrupt business as usual and wake them up and make them realize that business as usual cannot proceed. Yes, and sometimes that means that in fact, inevitably, it must mean that their lives are disrupted. And that they're going to be faced with a situation where change, substantial, fundamental change needs to happen. And you know, you have to bring it to a head so that they recognize that they can't just go on. We've seen this with many movements. The classic case in the United States is the Civil Rights Movement. And it did produce profound change over the course of decades. It's very powerful. And what you find is elites, well, you know, they're still really well off afterwards. They haven't lost anything of any significance. They feel they have, but in fact, you know, life on the other side is still good for them. They'll survive it. So yes, when people have been ignored and neglected and trampled on, and elites seem insulated from the consequences of such destructive behavior, well, they got to be awakened. And mass protests are often the only way to do that. To change the terms of discussion, to force people in power to come to terms with the actual problems that they're, you know, neglecting or imposing on other people. It's a vital part of every democratic order.
Thank you, Ms. Anderson, and thank you, Carolina. Ms. Anderson, let me introduce you to María Ignacia Gomez. She is the president of Ciudadanos, one of the liberal parties in Chile. María Ignacia, go ahead, please.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure, Professor Elizabeth, to have the opportunity for us in Ciudadanos to have this conversation with you. And also happy anniversary to Red Liberal, who is the organized this event. I will say my question in Spanish. So, Daniel, if you can translate me after. Ok. Uno de los postulados del libro de Elizabeth Anderson es la igualdad democrática y la necesidad, ¿cierto?, de que las personas puedan ejercer su ciudadanía en el espacio público. O sea, uno de los postulados es que las personas puedan ejercer esta ciudadanía en un espacio público en igualdad de condiciones. Y para ello, es muy importante que en ese espacio público se puedan legitimar nuevos interlocutores que han sido excluidos, como por ejemplo las mujeres o los pueblos originarios, por poner algunos ejemplos. Pero lo que está ocurriendo hoy día es que ese espacio público está cambiando sustancialmente por el fenómeno de las redes sociales. A mí me gustaría saber cuál es cómo ve Elizabeth el impacto que está teniendo la democracia y en el postulado de la igualdad democrática el fenómeno de las redes sociales hoy día en el mundo.
Right. So, so Maria Ignacia is asking, she starts by pointing out that in democratic equality, one of the requirements of democratic equality is that all people can exercise their citizenship in the public space under an equality of conditions. And for that, it is important to legitimize new actors who join public conversations. People who have historically been excluded, like perhaps women, Aboriginal peoples, and so forth, youth as well, young people. So the question is, well, that public space right now is changing. The public sphere is changing because of social networks, which are changing the terms of the discussion.
Social media, exactly.
Social media, sorry,
Yeah.
social media. So her question is, how do you think social media impacts this situation of democratic equality and the place these new voices have on the public sphere?
Yes. So I actually have a lot of problems with the way social media is organized right now. And a big problem has to do with the way algorithms are determining what information we are exposed to. So a combination of both algorithms and paid micro-targeted ads and news and so forth. What we found is that social media is very easily hacked by bad anti-democratic actors, propagandists of various sorts. Sometimes they're not actively trying to undermine democracy, even though they're doing that. Maybe they're just out for a buck. And they found certain formulas for drawing people's attention to outrages, false made-up stories, conspiracy theories that sow distrust and division and make democratic politics less possible, because without some foundation of social trust among the different social groups that constitute the polity, if everyone just thinks that whatever is coming out of another person's mouth has to be fake news or a lie, no real democratic discussion can take place among citizens. And so we have seen that social media can be hacked, and also that the algorithms tend to promote outrage, division. They're grossly amplifying the voices of propaganda, dissension, and division And so these kinds of voices are very hostile to the democratic project. But why amplify those voices? That's a choice that the social media CEOs are making. They do not have to rig their algorithms in such a way to make these kinds of voices of propaganda and division explode and be the most popular dominant things. We've actually seen that true news travels less far than fake news on social media. Less far and less rapidly than fake news. Okay, I think it's, I really think we shouldn't even be on social media. I think it's a toxic environment. We also see that marginalized voices are often further marginalized by campaigns of harassment, doxing, and threats, and so forth. I really think it's high time, and here I'm saying this is kind of weird because we're speaking over technology, but there's really a lot to be said for face-to-face conversation. People can hear your tone of voice. You can get real. It's very difficult to do that just with the written word. People want to know, well, are you sincere? Is this meaningful? Is this coming from the heart? It's not that people can't be deceived, but I think there's a lot less misunderstanding of the tone of voice and the emotional register. And this gets back, actually, Cristobal, to a question that you had pointed out about the role of emotions, and liberal discourse wants to wall that off and only talk about reason and so forth. I just think politics always involves the emotions. And indeed, a huge amount of political wisdom involves understanding the emotions that are driving people's political positions, especially when they're driven in authoritarian directions. Almost invariably, the emotions that drive authoritarianism are deeply connected to fear. And indeed, one of my teachers, Martha Nussbaum, wrote a wonderful book recently about this called The Monarchy of Fear. I think it's psychologically very, very insightful. I wouldn't be quite as reductive as she has. It's not all fear. I do think resentment is significantly different from fear, and that also powers a lot of authoritarian politics. But fear is a big one. And a lot of what we have to do in talking to our fellow citizens is communicating in such a way that we are not activating fear, but actually helping people see democratic politics as a path forward to peace. I think that is one of the greatest challenges of our current moment. And unfortunately, social media is pushing us in the other direction.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maria Ignacia. And Ms. Anderson, now we have 3 more questions that we're going to broadcast. The first question is of Claudio Castro. He's the mayor of Renca, one of the cities of Santiago. The next question is by Vlado Mirosevic. He's a congressman of the Liberal Party in Chile. And we're going to end up with Marcela Sabat. She's also a congresswoman of Renovación Nacional. So can we please broadcast?
Hello, everybody. I'm Claudio Castro. I'm the mayor of Renca, and I am very grateful and honored to be able to make this question. So, Renca is one of 32 different boroughs that conform the city of Santiago. We have 160,000 inhabitants, and Renca is considered a lower class neighborhood in the northwest area of the city. So our poverty rates are consistently higher than the average of Santiago. Our neighbors know a lot about how unfair life can be. Probably most of them would even say that they feel free to live their lives their own way, at least to some extent, but they know that they don't live equal lives than other people in terms of rights or in terms of have. Sorry for that introduction, but my question has to be with this individual aim to change, but this lack of collective awareness. So how privatized can our culture be? Is it possible to think in the working class as a collective energy able to push limits further for a better collective life? Can we think some collective framework to fight for deeper equality?
Hello, Professor Anderson. My name is Vlado Mirosevic. I am member of parliament representing the Liberal Party of Chile. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your ideas, because it's a big inspiration for me, for my party, for many people in Chile. My question is about democratic equality and indigenous people, because in Chile we have a big tensions with indigenous communities, because they are demanding more autonomy and demanding recognitions. Obviously, this is not an economic problem, this is a political problem. What do you think about democratic equality applied in these issues? Thank you again.
Primero que todo, saludarlos a todos y a todas esta tarde y agradecer, por supuesto, a Red Liberal por esta instancia. Quisiera reflexionar respecto a una discusión que se ha desencadenado durante los últimos años y que, si bien estaba presente, no había visto la luz con la fuerza con lo que se ha visto hoy día. El feminismo como causa refleja y reclama la lucha por el reconocimiento de la igualdad de derechos, de oportunidades y de dignidades entre hombres y mujeres. Usted escribió un artículo para el libro Igualitarismo, una discusión necesaria. En ese texto defiende la tesis de la igualdad democrática, que consiste, en términos muy generales, en que la construcción de una comunidad de iguales integra los principios de distribución en una comunidad de pares. En razón de esto, le pregunto, ¿es el feminismo una causa que debe ubicarse solo bajo la esfera del enfoque político? ¿Cuáles serían, según usted, los principios básicos del feminismo en un espacio de igualdad democrática?
So for the matter, I'll try to translate the last question. It's going to be a little bit weird because it's from English to Spanish back to English, so some of the concepts might get lost. So she starts with, first of all, I want to greet you all this afternoon and of course thank Red Liberal for this instance. I would like to revolve on a discussion that has been unleashed in recent years, which, although present, had not been discussed with this force as it is today. Feminism as a cause reflects and claims that the fight for the recognition of equal rights, opportunities, and equal dignity between men and women. You wrote an article for the book, What is the Point of Equality? In this text, you defend the thesis of democratic equality that says that the construction of a community of equals integrates the distribution principles of a community of peers. Because of this, I ask you, is feminism a cause that should be located only under the sphere of the political arena? What would you say that are the basic principles of feminism in a space of democratic equality? Professor Anderson, you are muted, so we can't hear you. So if somebody could please unmute Professor Anderson.
Here. I'm going to take these questions in reverse order of presentation. So let's start with feminism. I think of equality as essentially embodied in democratic structures, and democracy itself is not simply a legal order or an order for the state. Democracy can also structure smaller scale non-state organizations such as the workplace. But there's also an ethos of democracy, which is an ethos that we have to practice citizen to citizen, person to person. And that's something that can pervade all kinds of domains that aren't officially organized, including intimate relations, right? The ethos of democracy is an ethos in which we listen carefully and are attentive and responsive to the interests of all the affected parties. And everyone has a voice within that. And that's a principle that we can carry across many domains of life, not just what we call political, which it's a contested term, but some people mean by that just the domain of the state or, electoral politics. But feminism has always seen power relations, gender relations as pervading all kinds of social relations and domains of life. But a democratic ethos can inform those relationships instead of an authoritarian one. And in particular, we have to pay attention then to how the gendered order reinforces hierarchy and how we can reconfigure that order so as to enable equality. Moving on to the question of Indigenous rights. I'm not actually familiar with the legal background to Indigenous rights in Chile. So I feel a little bit cautious to say anything general. It seems to me that history matters a lot in understanding how to manage these problems. You might have heard that a very consequential Supreme Court case happened in the United States with respect to the tribal claims of American Indians in the state of Oklahoma. And the Supreme Court has recognized that about half of the state of Oklahoma is now tribal territory. It's a stunning decision. No one predicted it would turn out that way. It's quite amazing. But again, like the actual decision depends on treaties, historical treaties, and an accumulation of law. It's a very technical area, and I would be very reluctant to draw any conclusions across countries because so much depends on the histories of injustice and whatever previous institutional arrangements had been put in place. But I would say that this was a stunning victory for Indigenous people's rights in the United States, and no one saw it coming. It was quite remarkable. And then the last question about a poor neighborhood in Santiago. I wasn't quite sure I understood the thrust of the question, but part of it concerned the importance of community. And I did want to comment on that. So in general, the poorer people are, the less they're able to make use of the market to get access to essential goods, and the more they rely on personal relationships in communal webs. Well, if you don't have money, right, you can't like hire a babysitter, right? You're going to call on extended family members or perhaps neighbors, friends. This is just inherent. And so as a result, one of the consequences of this is that poor people's lives are much more susceptible to disruption through policies that disorder their ability to form those communal relationships. So in particular, if they have unstable housing and they get dispersed, that's a much greater disaster than for members of the professional managerial class who could pretty much make their way in any urban center practically in the world because they have the material resources to buy whatever they need. So we see here radically unequal levels of mobility, geographic mobility, and policies could either cater to people who are highly mobile, or we could think about policies that could help people sustain community. That is, these tighter networks of non-market relationships through which people gain access to important goods. So I do think bringing back to the general theme of relational egalitarianism, what this means is that public policy with respect to less advantaged people has to be especially attentive to the importance of non-market relationships that are often in these communal networks. And policy needs to find ways to enable people to sustain those relationships where they're living. Now, it's also really great to give them resources so that maybe they're not so dependent. But we also have to recognize that people's identities are very closely wrapped up with community too. So it's not a neutral decision to say, here's some cash to make up for it. Right, and you know, what's the right balance? It could only be struck by including the people themselves into the conversation to see what matters to them.
Well, I think we're done with the questions, Jorge. Okay, we want to thank Professor Elizabeth Anderson. It has been really a pleasure and an honor for us for your insightful ideas and powerful thought. This was not a lecture, but it is a celebration of a political movement that nowadays is trying to create networks across the landscape, the political landscape, across political parties, actors, and intellectuals that to some extent self-denominated liberal. So thanks very much, Professor Anderson. I'm pretty sure this is not going to be the last time that we talk. You are invited to Chile.
I would love to visit sometime once the pandemic's over.
So thanks very much. And I think we all want
to give you a Thank you, Professor Anderson.
Thank you for inviting me. It was a pleasure.
Thanks very much. And now, if you want, of course, you are dismissed. You can go if you want. But now we have, I think, a last intervention. Rodrigo Rettig, que es el secretario general de Ciudadanos, one of the political parties, who's joining today. Rodrigo, ¿estás con nosotros, no?
Sí, acá estamos.
Rodrigo Rettig, secretario general de Ciudadanos.
Thanks, first of all, to Elizabeth Anderson for sharing her great knowledge with people who love to talk about politics, freedom, and also with some kind of equality. It is a pleasure to be able to listen to it and delve into concepts of interest, especially in Chile after October 2019. Thanks to Red Libra for the incredible management of having she with us and allowing me to give these words at closing. It's an honor. Given the name of the theory of justice that Elizabeth Anderson offers us, which is democratic equality, it seems important to me to relieve the first of the words, equality. This word was illegitimately eroded by Fabrist regimes that seeking to make everyone equal in everything, ended up mutilating freedom. Equality is an essential part of freedom, and that desirable equality to seek is that of everyone in at least something, not of everyone in everything. And here comes the concept of democratic equality. Professor Brieba even concludes in his analysis of Anderson that Anderson's theory, rather than a theory of justice, seeks to place the role of equality in this. What if that freedom and equality weren't opposed? What if the way most of us think about the relation between equality and freedom is wrong? To be truly free, in Anderson's assessment, members of a society had to be able to function as human beings, to participate in production, to execute their role as citizens, and to move through civil society. This type of equality aims at the horizontality of social relations. This weekend, we had a graphic episode on social networks regarding unequal treatment in Viña del Mar, where one person insults and mistreats another by virtue of their apparent better social position, realizing how painful it means for the insulted, but also to the observer. It is interesting to note that Anderson's standard of sufficiency is going to depend on the society in question, and that they are model concepts. Looking for a sufficiency standard in Germany, according to current realities, is not the same as in Chile. Probably in Chile we are going to have to do much more than the Germans will do to achieve democratic equality. With this, what I want to point out is that democratic equality with redistributive equality in Chile are not necessarily opposite, but rather complement and interlace each other, but they are not enemies. Even Anderson differs from the egalitarian of the lack of option, who point out that as long as the result is the effect of the person option, he does not generate any moral obligation of reparation, like the player who loses everything in the casino. Anderson refutes this, arguing that this allows various forms of abandonment to be incurred and affects equal consideration. In justifying the capabilities approach to justice, a book of 2010, Anderson tells us that the standard of sufficiency must be such that it guarantees everyone to be a full member of society. It implies having the capacity to function, and not just opportunities. Finally, I suggest to the auditors that if they want to delve into Anderson's remarkable content, look for a talk she gave in April 2019 called The Great Reversal: How Neoliberalism Turned the Economic Aspirations of Liberalism Upside Down, in the which explains why the classic liberalism of Smith, Locke, who was pro-workers, must be distinguished with the neoliberal somersault, which allowed, she says, with a critical vision, financial deregulation, tax reduction, and privatization of public services. This should make us reflect on the synergy of Anderson's theories, or failing that, the eventual divorce that exists between them and the Chile-built post-dictatorship, which, with its lights and shadows, laid the foundations for an excessively mercantilist system, which it seems to be affect the theory of justice on democratic equality that the author we have invited today holds. There's an urgent need to talk about social justice again. The upcoming plebiscite is a great opportunity for that. Thank you very much, Ms. Anderson.
Thank you.
Thanks to you, Rodrigo. And our president, Jorge Arias, can you say goodbye to all of us?
Well,
and thanks to you, of course.
Again, Ms. Anderson, thank you very much for participating with us. We can stop repeating how big of an honor is to have you with us. So, muchas gracias a todos. Espero que esta haya sido un momento importante para Red Liberal, una linda forma de empezar a conmemorar los 10 años. Y buenas noches a todos. Good night, Ms. Anderson.
Gracias. Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Thank you.
Ciao, ciao.
Bye.
And